Thomas rode slowly along the dusty trail, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the rolling hills of the Wild West. The wind rustled the dry grass, and the distant cry of a hawk echoed through the valley. He had been traveling for several days, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds of dust with every step, and the solitude of the journey had left him deep in thought. Life on the frontier was never easy, and Thomas was used to long stretches of isolation. But today there was something different in the air, a sense of quiet that felt almost alive. As he crested a small rise, Thomas noticed a glimmer of water below. It was a small lake, hidden among a cluster of tall oak and pine trees, and the sunlight danced across its surface like 1,000 tiny diamonds. He slowed his horse, fascinated by the sight. The lake was so clear and inviting that he felt an immediate pull toward it, as though it were calling him to rest for a while. His horse, sensing the change in pace, nudged him gently, and Thomas guided the animal down the slope toward the water's edge. The trail ended at a small clearing where wildflowers grew in colorful patches, and the air smelled fresh and sweet, mingled with the earthy scent of pine needles. Thomas dismounted and tied his horse to a sturdy tree, giving it a moment to graze. He took a deep breath, enjoying the cool breeze that came off the water. It was a perfect spot to rest, maybe even to refill his canteen. He stepped closer to the lake, careful not to disturb the peace that seemed to hang over the place like a delicate veil. Then, just as he reached the water, he saw them. 3 young Apache women were bathing in the lake, their laughter ringing through the trees like soft bells. The sunlight caught the droplets of water as they fell from their hair, making the scene sparkle. Thomas froze, not out of fear, but because he knew he had stumbled upon something private, something he was never meant to see. He immediately averted his eyes, stepping back behind a large boulder, his heart beating fast in his chest. The women seemed unaware of his presence at first, moving gracefully in the water, speaking in low voices he couldn't understand. They were beautiful, but Thomas's admiration was tempered by respect. He reminded himself that he was an outsider in their world, and that the moment he had witnessed was sacred and personal. He quietly observed from a distance, careful not to make a sound, and tried to calm his racing mind. He told himself that he would turn around and leave, that this was not his place to intrude. As he watched, Thomas began to notice the harmony in the scene. The water reflected the deep blue sky, and the trees swayed gently, creating patterns of light and shadow across the surface. The women moved with a natural elegance, splashing water at each other playfully, their voices full of joy. For a moment, Thomas forgot the danger of being seen. He felt a strange sense of peace, as if the world had stopped for just this instant. But then one of the women looked up. Her eyes met his through the branches, and Thomas felt a sudden, chilling awareness that he had been seen. She didn't scream or shout. Instead, she raised her hand slightly and motioned for him to stay where he was. Thomas's heart leapt into his throat. He had no idea what would happen next, and every instinct told him to run. Yet he couldn't move. He stood frozen, his hands gripping the rough surface of the boulder, his mind racing with thoughts of what he should do. The other 2 women quickly joined her, their eyes sharp and steady. They stepped out of the water, wrapping themselves in blankets and robes they had left nearby. Thomas could now see that they were tall, strong, and confident, moving with a poise that spoke of years of living close to the land and understanding its ways. There was no anger in their eyes, only a quiet intensity, a seriousness that made Thomas realize that this encounter was far from ordinary. One of the women spoke, and though he could not understand her words, the tone was clear. It was a voice full of authority and expectation, and it seemed to echo through the clearing. Thomas swallowed hard, unsure if he should respond, speak, or remain silent. The moment stretched on, the tension growing with each heartbeat. He could feel the sun warming his back, the gentle breeze brushing his face, and yet his entire attention was fixed on the 3 figures before him. He thought about turning and riding away, leaving the lake and the women behind. But something held him in place, a mixture of curiosity and respect. He wanted to understand what had just happened, to make sense of the silent communication between them. Slowly, he took a careful step forward, making sure not to appear threatening. His eyes met theirs again, and he gave a small, polite nod, trying to show that he meant no harm. The women exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Thomas could feel the weight of their gaze, as if they were assessing his character, measuring his intentions. He realized that in their eyes he was not just a man who had stumbled upon a private moment. He was a visitor in their world, a stranger whose actions could have consequences he could not yet imagine. He took another step, careful and deliberate, and hoped that his calm demeanor would reassure them. After a few tense moments, one of the women spoke again, her voice carrying a different tone now, softer but still firm. She gestured toward the edge of the clearing, as if inviting Thomas to come closer. He hesitated, unsure whether this was a test, a trap, or a genuine offer to communicate. Gathering his courage, he stepped out from behind the boulder and slowly approached the clearing. Every movement was careful, every step deliberate, as he tried to show respect and humility. The women did not move from their spot, but they watched him intently. Thomas could feel their eyes examining him, reading him in a way that made him feel exposed and vulnerable, yet strangely connected. He realized that this encounter was about more than just the accident of seeing them. There was a sense of expectation, a set of unspoken rules that he had yet to understand. He took a deep breath, steadying himself and prepared for whatever would come next. As he reached the edge of the clearing, Thomas noticed the details of the scene more clearly: the smooth surface of the water, the way the sunlight hit the leaves, the delicate patterns of flowers along the shore. Everything seemed sharper, more vivid, as if the world itself was paying attention to this moment. He felt a strange mix of awe and fear, realizing that his actions in the next few moments could shape what happened here. The women's leader stepped forward slightly, her gaze never leaving his. Thomas stopped, unsure if he should speak. He finally managed to find his voice, his words careful and respectful. I am sorry," he said softly. "I did not mean to intrude. I will leave if that is what you wish." His voice sounded small in the vast clearing, yet he hoped it conveyed sincerity. For a long moment there was silence. Thomas could hear the gentle lapping of the water, the distant call of birds, the wind rustling through the trees. Then slowly one of the women spoke again. Her tone was not angry, but firm, and it carried a weight of authority that Thomas could not ignore. He listened carefully, trying to understand the meaning behind her words, even though he could not grasp them fully. He realized that this moment was the beginning of something he could never have expected, a story that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Thomas felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He had not been driven away, but he knew that the encounter was far from over. The women's eyes held a promise of challenge, of lessons to be learned, and perhaps even of danger. Yet, despite the uncertainty, he felt a strange sense of curiosity and respect growing within him. He realized that this hidden lake, these 3 Apache women, and the quiet wilderness around them were about to change his life in ways he could not yet imagine. He took another cautious step forward, ready to listen, ready to learn, and ready to face whatever came next. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden rays across the clearing, and the lake shimmered like liquid gold. Thomas knew that he had entered a world both beautiful and mysterious, and that he could never turn back to the life he had known before. Thomas stood at the edge of the clearing, his heart still pounding in his chest. The 3 Apache women had stepped fully onto the shore, their robes wrapped around them. Yet there was an unmistakable confidence in their posture. Their eyes never left him, sharp and knowing, as if they could see not just his body but his very thoughts. For a moment, Thomas felt exposed in a way he had never experienced before. It was not fear alone that ran through him. It was a mix of awe, confusion, and a deep sense of responsibility. He tried to gather his thoughts. He had grown up hearing stories of the Apache people, tales that spoke of bravery, honor, and unyielding traditions. But those were stories told by others, filtered through generations, often exaggerated. Now standing here, Thomas realized how little he truly understood. The women before him were not characters in a story. They were real, living, and formidable. He had trespassed unknowingly, but he knew the mistake could carry serious consequences. The woman who had first confronted him stepped a little closer, her eyes unwavering. Thomas noticed the subtle movements she made, the way her fingers brushed against the fabric of her robe as if measuring him, testing him. Her voice, when she finally spoke again, was firm and clear, though Thomas could not understand the words. Still, the tone was unmistakable. She was speaking with authority, and it was clear she expected a response. Thomas swallowed hard and bowed his head slightly, trying to convey respect without overstepping boundaries. "I did not mean to intrude," he said again, his voice steadier this time. "I will leave if that is what you wish." His words were simple, but he hoped they carried sincerity. He knew that in situations like this, humility could sometimes bridge the gap between misunderstanding and danger. The women exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Thomas could feel their eyes scanning him, as though weighing his character, searching for signs of honesty or deceit. It was a feeling he had never experienced before, and it made him acutely aware of every movement, every breath he took. He realized that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. It was a test, and he had only just stepped onto the playing field. Then something unexpected happened. The woman who had first confronted him raised her hand, pointing toward a spot near the water. At first, Thomas did not understand, but slowly he realized she was signaling him to come closer. Not recklessly, but carefully. His mind raced. Was this an invitation or another challenge? Could he trust them? He decided to take a careful step forward, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. As he approached, the women did not move from their position, but their eyes followed every step. Thomas noticed details he had missed before. The way the sunlight highlighted the patterns in their hair, the subtle strength in their posture, the quiet confidence in every motion. He felt both nervous and captivated. He reminded himself that he must stay calm, respectful, and aware. One wrong move could ruin everything. When he reached a respectful distance, the woman spoke again. Her tone was different now, softer yet still commanding. It was as if she had decided to test him in a way that words alone could not convey. Thomas realized that understanding them would require more than just listening. It would require observation, patience, and an open mind. He nodded slowly, indicating that he was ready to learn, ready to show that he meant no harm. The other two women stepped forward slightly, their eyes focused on him as well. It was clear that they were united in purpose, watching him carefully to see how he would respond. Thomas noticed a subtle rhythm in their movements, almost like a dance, each action deliberate, precise, and meaningful. It struck him that their world operated on a set of rules and customs that he had yet to comprehend, and that his survival and acceptance depended on his ability to respect those rules. He thought back to the stories he had heard about Apache customs. There were tales of bravery, of trials that tested a person's heart and character. Perhaps this was such a moment, a challenge not of weapons, but of understanding, respect, and courage. Thomas took a deep breath, steadying himself, and allowed his mind to clear of fear and confusion. He knew that whatever happened next, he must act with integrity and humility. The woman spoke again, and this time Thomas noticed a change in her expression. There was curiosity mixed with seriousness, a silent question in her eyes. He realized that she was not simply confronting him for having seen them. She was assessing him, determining whether he could navigate their world without causing harm. He nodded slightly, trying to communicate that he understood, that he would honor their expectations. Time seemed to stretch. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, the trees whispered with the wind, and Thomas felt the weight of every second. The women did not speak in words he could understand, but their presence conveyed meaning far beyond language. He realized that communication was about more than words. It was about gestures, respect, and attentiveness. He studied their movements, noting every small signal, trying to respond with the proper care. Suddenly, the woman closest to him motioned for him to sit on a nearby rock. Hesitant but willing, Thomas complied, careful not to appear rushed or anxious. The three women watched him closely, their eyes never leaving his face. He felt a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation. For the first time, he realized that this encounter could be a turning point in his life, that he had entered a world filled with both challenge and beauty. Sitting there, Thomas tried to calm his racing thoughts. He reflected on how he had traveled alone for so long, accustomed to making decisions without input or guidance. Here, though, he was a guest in a world that demanded respect, patience, and attentiveness. The realization humbled him. He understood that his actions, his words, and even his thoughts carried weight in this moment. It was a lesson in mindfulness, one that he could not ignore. The women's leader stood silently for a moment, then extended her hand toward the water, signaling for Thomas to look. He followed her gesture and saw something that made his heart skip a beat. In the lake, reflections danced across the surface, reflections not just of the sky or trees but of the women themselves, poised with confidence and grace. It was as if the water was showing him a mirror of the world he had stumbled into, a world of beauty, tradition, and strength. Thomas realized that their actions were deliberate, that every movement had meaning. This was more than a confrontation. It was a lesson in observation, respect, and understanding. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for being allowed to witness even a fraction of their world, and he silently promised himself to honor it. The weight of the moment pressed on him, yet he felt strangely alive, connected to something greater than himself. The women spoke again, this time pointing toward a path that led away from the lake. Thomas understood the meaning. They were giving him a choice, a chance to follow or turn away. He hesitated, feeling the pull of curiosity and the fear of the unknown. Finally, he nodded, signaling that he would follow. The leader gave a small approving gesture, and the other two women relaxed slightly, their eyes softening. As they moved together along the path, Thomas noticed how in tune the women were with their surroundings. Every step was deliberate, every movement purposeful. He struggled to match their rhythm, but he did his best, aware that his actions reflected his respect for them and their customs. The path led through the forest, with sunlight streaming through the canopy, creating patterns on the ground that seemed almost magical. Thomas felt as if he had stepped into a different world, one filled with lessons and mysteries waiting to be uncovered. They stopped at a small clearing where the women set down their robes and sat in a circle. Thomas took a seat at the edge, careful to maintain the proper distance. The leader's eyes met his again, and Thomas understood that he was being assessed once more. He held her gaze, showing patience, attentiveness, and humility. The silence stretched, filled only by the gentle sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the soft murmur of the lake behind them. Finally, the leader spoke, her voice calm and steady. Thomas could not understand the words, but the tone was clear. She was explaining something important, and he realized that this was a turning point. He listened carefully, focusing on her gestures, expressions, and the rhythm of her speech. He understood enough to know that respect, honesty, and courage were required, not just in words, but in actions and intentions. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing, Thomas felt a mixture of anticipation and understanding. He realized that the encounter at the lake was only the beginning, that the challenges ahead would test him in ways he could not yet imagine, but he also felt a sense of purpose, a growing determination to rise to the occasion and honor the trust the women had extended to him, even without words. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The world seemed sharper, more vivid, and filled with possibility. Thomas knew that he had entered a chapter of his life that would change him forever, and that the lessons of respect, patience, and courage he was beginning to learn here would stay with him long after he left this hidden lake in the Wild West. Thomas followed the three Apache women as they led him deeper into the forest, the soft crunch of dry leaves underfoot, the only sound apart from the occasional bird call. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the hills, painting the sky with shades of gold, orange, and pink. He felt a strange mixture of awe and unease, walking in a world so different from the one he had known. Every step seemed to carry weight. Every glance was filled with meaning, and he realized that he was no longer just a traveler passing through. He was part of a story unfolding in real time. The women moved with effortless grace, navigating the forest as if it were an extension of themselves. Thomas struggled to keep up, careful not to stumble over roots or rocks, but also careful not to appear clumsy or disrespectful. He noticed the precision in their movements, the way they stepped lightly, how their eyes scanned the surroundings, and how they seemed to communicate silently with one another. Even without understanding their words, Thomas sensed a deep connection between them, a unity that came from years of living closely with each other and with the land. After a while, they reached a small clearing where the forest opened up to reveal a cluster of simple, well-kept dwellings. Smoke rose from small fires curling into the evening sky, and the scent of herbs and cooked food filled the air. Children played quietly nearby, and the sound of laughter mingled with the soft calls of animals. Thomas paused at the edge of the clearing, taking in the scene. It was a community that seemed self-sufficient, harmonious, and deeply connected to the land. For a moment he felt both humbled and curious. The leader of the women stopped and turned to him. Her eyes were serious but not unkind. She gestured for him to sit on a flat stone near the edge of the clearing. Thomas obeyed, unsure of what would come next. The other two women took positions nearby, their gazes steady and attentive. It became clear to Thomas that he was not just a guest. He was being assessed. Every movement, every expression, every word or lack of words would be noticed. He reminded himself to remain calm, respectful, and observant. The leader began a series of gestures and sounds, slow and deliberate, as if explaining something important. Though Thomas could not understand the words, he watched carefully, noticing patterns and repetitions. He realized that she was communicating rules and expectations, perhaps even explaining why he had been confronted at the lake. His heart pounded with anticipation. Understanding would come not only through listening but through patience, observation, and humility. The other women added their own gestures, demonstrating actions that Thomas slowly began to interpret. They moved to gather firewood, showing how to select the right branches and how to stack them for a fire. Thomas mimicked their actions, careful not to make mistakes, learning not just by instruction but by watching and doing. Every small action carried significance, and he realized that respect in their world was shown through both attention to detail and the willingness to learn. As the evening deepened, the leader beckoned him closer to the fire they had built. Thomas noticed how the flames reflected in her eyes, and for a moment, he felt a sense of connection, a silent acknowledgement that he was beginning to understand. She handed him a small piece of food, a simple offering of roasted corn and berries. Thomas accepted it with a nod, savoring the taste and the gesture. It was not just nourishment. It was a symbol of trust and acceptance. Over the next several hours, Thomas learned more about the customs of the women in their community. They showed him how to identify edible plants, how to read signs in nature, and how to move quietly and respectfully through the forest. Each lesson was accompanied by careful observation and gentle correction when necessary. Thomas struggled at times, but he welcomed the challenges, realizing that every mistake was also an opportunity to grow and show humility. As the sky darkened and stars began to twinkle above, the women led Thomas to a quiet spot overlooking the lake he had stumbled upon earlier. The water shimmered in the moonlight, silver and still. They motioned for him to sit and watch. Thomas did so, and for the first time he felt a deep sense of reflection. The events of the day, the confrontation, the guidance, the lessons, had shifted something within him. He understood that respect, trust, and integrity were not abstract ideas but living practices, evident in every action and every interaction in this community. The leader spoke again, her voice low and steady, and Thomas realized that this was a moment of teaching rather than confrontation. She gestured toward the lake and then to him, as if explaining the meaning of the earlier encounter. Though he could not understand the exact words, he sensed the lesson. To see someone in their private moment was not just an accident. It carried responsibility. Respect and honesty were essential, and the choices he made next would reflect the kind of person he truly was. Thomas nodded slowly, indicating that he understood. He felt a wave of humility wash over him. He had always thought of himself as capable and self-reliant, but he now realized that true understanding came from listening, observing, and respecting the traditions of others. The women's expectations were not arbitrary. They were expressions of a deeply held way of life, one built on trust, honor, and communal care. The night deepened, and the air grew cooler. Thomas noticed how the women moved with care, wrapping themselves in blankets, tending to small fires, and quietly preparing for sleep. He realized that he had much to learn about patience, observation, and the rhythms of this life. Yet despite the challenge, he felt a sense of anticipation rather than dread. Each lesson, each instruction, each moment of observation was building a bridge between him and a world he had never known, but now deeply respected. Over the next few days, Thomas continued to learn and adapt. He joined the women in their daily tasks, gathering water from the lake, helping to tend small gardens, and learning the techniques they used for hunting small game. Each task required attention, respect, and careful observation. Mistakes were met with gentle correction, and successes were acknowledged with quiet approval. Thomas began to feel a growing sense of belonging, not because he was fully accepted yet, but because he was making the effort to honor their ways. During this time, he also learned about the strength and intelligence of the women. They were not merely participants in a ritual, They were skilled, knowledgeable, and capable of surviving and thriving in a world that demanded resilience. Thomas admired their courage and independence, realizing that he had entered a world where strength was expressed not through force alone, but through wisdom, care, and connection to the land. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned a deep indigo, the leader took Thomas aside. She led him to a quiet spot near the edge of the forest, away from the others. There she made gestures that Thomas interpreted as a test, a challenge to demonstrate his understanding of respect, patience, and integrity. He listened carefully, watched intently, and responded with thoughtful actions. The test was not about strength or skill alone. It was about character, about showing that he could honor the expectations of those around him. Thomas felt a sense of accomplishment as he completed the tasks, though he knew he had much more to learn. The leader nodded approvingly, a silent acknowledgement that he was making progress. He realized that this journey was not only about survival, but also about growth, about learning to navigate a world built on principles he had never fully considered. Each day brought new lessons. Each interaction was an opportunity to understand more deeply, and each challenge strengthened his sense of humility and respect. By the end of the week, Thomas had begun to feel a connection to the community that went beyond mere observation. He had learned the importance of patience, the value of careful attention, and the necessity of respect in every action. The women had become his teachers, guiding him through a world that was both beautiful and demanding. Thomas understood that the encounter at the lake had been only the beginning, a doorway into a deeper understanding of life, honor, and the bonds that held this community together. As he lay beneath the stars one night, listening to the soft sounds of the forest and the distant ripple of the lake, Thomas reflected on how much he had changed. He was no longer a stranger passing through. He was a participant in a story that was unfolding slowly, with lessons that would stay with him forever. He understood now that respect, courage, and integrity were not just ideas. They were lived experiences, expressed through every careful movement, every thoughtful word, and every moment of attentive observation. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling both gratitude and determination. He knew that the journey ahead would bring more challenges, more tests of character, and more opportunities to prove himself worthy of trust and acceptance. But he also felt a growing sense of hope. The women had shown him the path, and he was ready to walk it step by careful step, learning, respecting, and growing with every day that passed. The following morning, Thomas awoke to the soft sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the gentle murmur of the lake. The air was cool, and dew glistened on the grass. He stretched and took a deep breath, feeling the crispness of the morning fill his lungs. Today, he knew, would be different. The leader of the 3 Apache women had indicated that he would face challenges, and Thomas understood that these trials were not only tests of skill, but also of character, patience, and respect. He rose carefully, mindful not to disturb the quiet of the forest or the peaceful rhythm of the community. After breakfast, the leader approached him with a calm but firm expression. She gestured toward the forest, indicating that he should follow. Thomas complied, his mind racing with curiosity and a touch of nervousness. The other 2 women joined them, their eyes observing him closely. As they walked, Thomas noticed how the women moved with a natural confidence, stepping lightly over roots and stones, scanning the surroundings with ease. He tried to mirror their movements, keeping his steps careful and deliberate, aware that every action was being watched. The first challenge came sooner than he expected. The leader led Thomas to a small clearing where a narrow stream ran through the forest. She pointed to a fallen tree that spanned the water, and then to the other side, clearly indicating that he must cross. Thomas examined the log carefully. It was narrow and uneven, and the water below was swift. He hesitated for a moment, knowing that balance and concentration would be essential. The leader's eyes met his, steady and encouraging, and he realized that hesitation was part of the test. He needed to approach the task with calm focus, not fear. Thomas stepped onto the log cautiously, feeling it wobble beneath his weight. He extended his arms for balance and took slow, deliberate steps. The wind whispered through the trees, and the sun sparkled on the water below. For a moment, fear rose in his chest, but he reminded himself to trust his instincts and move steadily. Halfway across, the log shifted slightly and he nearly lost his footing. The leader's steady gaze, along with the quiet encouragement of the other two women, helped him regain control. Step by step, he made it to the other side, feeling a surge of accomplishment. The women nodded approvingly, and Thomas realized that this simple act was more than a test of physical skill. It was a lesson in patience, concentration, and calm under pressure. The next challenge was different. The women led him to a small clearing where they had arranged several objects on the ground, bundles of herbs, small stones, and wooden sticks. They gestured for him to identify each one and use them in a specific way. Thomas observed carefully, noticing how the women handled the objects with care and precision. He mimicked their movements, arranging the sticks, stacking the stones, and handling the herbs gently. At first, he fumbled, unsure of the correct order or placement. The leader corrected him patiently, showing him the proper way to handle each item. Slowly, he began to understand the rhythm and method, realizing that attention to detail and careful observation were key to success. After successfully completing this task, Thomas felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He realized that the women were not merely testing him, they were teaching him, guiding him to understand their ways and values. Every challenge carried a lesson. Every correction was an opportunity to grow. He felt a growing respect for their patience and wisdom, and a desire to prove that he was capable of honoring their traditions. The final challenge of the day was the most daunting. The women led Thomas to a rocky hillside overlooking the lake. The path was steep, uneven, and scattered with loose stones. The leader indicated that he must climb to a specific point at the top and retrieve a small object placed there. Thomas's heart raced as he looked up at the incline. He knew that this task would test his strength, endurance, and determination. He took a deep breath and began the climb, careful to place each foot securely and maintain his balance. The ascent was grueling. Rocks slipped beneath his feet, and branches snagged at his clothes. Several times he stumbled and nearly fell. The women's calm voices guided him, encouraging him to move steadily, breathe deeply, and focus on each step. Thomas pushed forward, drawing on every ounce of strength and determination he possessed. The hillside seemed endless, but he refused to give up. He reminded himself that this challenge was not just about reaching the top. It was about demonstrating patience, resilience, and respect for the journey itself. Finally, after what felt like hours, Thomas reached the top. He retrieved the small object, a carved stone, and held it carefully in his hands. The view from the top was breathtaking. The lake shimmered below, the forest stretched out in every direction, and the mountains loomed in the distance. For a moment, Thomas felt a deep sense of awe and accomplishment. The women's approval was clear in their eyes, and he realized that he had earned a small measure of trust. The descent was equally challenging, but Thomas moved with greater confidence, applying the lessons he had learned during the climb. He reached the base safely, greeted by the approving nods of the three women. They led him back to the clearing where the community had gathered to observe his efforts. Children peeked from behind trees, elders smiled quietly, and Thomas felt a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. He realized that the challenges had not only tested his abilities, they had connected him to the community and its values in a way that words alone could never convey. Over the next few days, Thomas faced additional challenges, each designed to test a different aspect of his character. He helped with hunting, learning to track small animals and move silently through the forest. He assisted in gathering food and firewood, understanding the importance of patience, respect, and cooperation. He learned to observe the rhythms of nature, to notice the subtle signs of weather changes, and to recognize the habits of animals. Each task was a lesson in responsibility and attentiveness, and Thomas embraced every opportunity to learn. The women also tested his judgment and decision-making. On one occasion, they presented him with a difficult choice: to follow a familiar path or to take a more challenging route that required careful observation and thought. Thomas hesitated, weighing his options. He recalled the lessons he had learned about patience, respect, and careful attention. He chose the more difficult path, moving slowly and observing every detail. The women's eyes followed him, and when he completed the task successfully, they nodded in quiet approval. He realized that their tests were not arbitrary. They were designed to teach him the value of thoughtful action and integrity. Throughout these challenges, Thomas also learned more about the strength and intelligence of the women. They were skilled in every aspect of survival, from gathering food and navigating the forest to understanding the natural world and its rhythms. They were patient teachers, guiding him with a balance of firmness and encouragement. Thomas began to understand that their culture was built on principles of respect, cooperation, and deep knowledge of the land. He felt a growing admiration for their wisdom and resilience, recognizing that his own knowledge and experience were limited compared to theirs. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of red and gold, the leader called Thomas aside. She gestured for him to sit near the lake, and he complied, feeling a mix of anticipation and respect. She spoke in her language, her gestures precise and deliberate. Though Thomas could not understand the words, he followed her instructions carefully, demonstrating his growing understanding of her expectations. The task was not simple. It required patience, careful observation, and thoughtful action. When he completed it successfully, the leader's eyes softened, and she gave a small, approving nod. Thomas felt a surge of pride tempered by humility, realizing that he was only beginning to understand the depth of what he was learning. By the end of the week, Thomas had completed a series of challenges that tested his courage, patience, skill, and character. He had learned to move silently through the forest, to observe the natural world with care, and to act with integrity in every task. More importantly, he had begun to understand the values of the community, the importance of respect, the strength of cooperation, and the wisdom that comes from living in harmony with the land. The women had not only tested him, they had guided him, teaching lessons that would stay with him for a lifetime. As he lay beneath the stars that night, listening to the gentle sounds of the forest and the lake, Thomas reflected on his journey. He realized that the challenges had not only tested his abilities, but had also transformed his understanding of the world. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the guidance he had received, and a growing determination to honor the trust and respect the women had shown him. He understood that the path ahead would continue to test him, but he felt ready to face whatever challenges came next, knowing that he had learned the value of patience, courage, and integrity. As the days passed, Thomas felt a growing connection to the land, the lake, and the 3 Apache women who had become both his teachers and guides. Each morning he awoke to the gentle sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the soft ripple of the lake. The women were always near, guiding him with patience and wisdom, their eyes quietly watching his every movement. Thomas had learned to move carefully, observe closely, and act with humility and respect. He realized that the journey he had begun at the lake had transformed him, teaching him lessons far beyond what he had ever imagined. One morning, the leader approached Thomas with a calm yet serious expression. She gestured for him to follow her to a spot near the lake where sunlight danced across the water, making it sparkle like thousands of tiny diamonds. Thomas obeyed, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. He had come to understand that this moment might be important, perhaps the culmination of the lessons he had been learning for weeks. The other 2 women followed quietly, their presence steady and reassuring. When they reached the clearing, the leader spoke in her language, her gestures deliberate and precise. Though Thomas could not understand the exact words, he sensed their significance. She was conveying a message of trust and respect, acknowledging his growth and his efforts to honor their customs. Thomas nodded slowly, trying to convey gratitude and understanding. The women's eyes held a quiet intensity, as if measuring the depth of his character and the sincerity of his intentions. The leader then performed a series of actions, demonstrating a ritual Thomas had observed from a distance when he first arrived at the lake. She moved with grace and purpose, her hands tracing patterns in the air and over the water. Thomas watched intently, understanding that he was being invited to participate in a moment of cultural significance. With careful attention, he followed her movements, mimicking the gestures as best as he could. Every action required focus and respect, and he felt a deep sense of responsibility to honor the tradition accurately. The other 2 women joined in, creating a rhythm that Thomas could sense even without understanding the words. The ceremony was both beautiful and solemn, a dance of respect, trust, and connection to the land and to one another. Thomas felt a sense of unity with the women and the environment around him. The lake reflected the moonlight, the trees swayed gently, and the quiet of the forest seemed to embrace them. For the first time, Thomas felt that he was truly part of their world, not just an observer but a participant who had earned a place through effort, respect, and humility. After the ceremony, the leader approached Thomas again. She spoke slowly, using gestures to indicate a final test of character. Thomas understood that this was not about skill or strength, but about his heart and his intentions. The women wanted to ensure that he had learned the true meaning of respect, patience, and integrity. Thomas nodded, determined to demonstrate the lessons he had absorbed over the past weeks. The test was simple in its appearance, but profound in its meaning. The leader handed him a small object, a carved stone, and instructed him to carry it across the clearing without dropping it or allowing it to touch the ground. At first it seemed easy, but Thomas quickly realized that the task required more than steady hands. It demanded focus, mindfulness, and an awareness of his surroundings. He moved carefully, adjusting his grip and balancing his steps, fully aware that the women's eyes followed every motion. As he carried the stone, Thomas reflected on all he had learned: the patience required to observe the forest, the humility necessary to accept guidance, the courage to face challenges, and the respect for the traditions of a world not his own. Each lesson guided his movements, helping him maintain concentration and purpose. When he finally placed the stone carefully at the designated spot, the leader smiled softly and the other two women nodded approvingly. Thomas felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not just for completing the task, but for understanding the deeper lesson it represented. The women then invited him to sit by the lake, and Thomas complied, feeling a sense of calm and anticipation. The leader spoke again, her gestures conveying acknowledgement and acceptance. Though Thomas could not understand every word, he sensed a final message of trust and inclusion. He realized that the journey that had begun with an unexpected encounter at the lake had reached a turning point. He had proven his character, shown respect, and demonstrated a willingness to learn and honor the women's ways. Over the next few days, Thomas continued to participate in the community's daily life, but now with a sense of confidence and belonging. The women included him in their routines, allowing him to help with gathering food, tending to small gardens, and learning more about the rhythms of the land. He observed the children playing and joined in teaching moments, feeling a connection that went beyond simple survival. The community's respect and acceptance were no longer tentative. They were real and tangible. Thomas also spent quiet moments alone, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the lake, the first glimpse of the three women, and the lessons he had learned along the way. He understood that respect and trust were earned through effort, patience, and humility. He had entered this world as an outsider, unaware of its rules and customs, but he was leaving it with a profound understanding of honor, community, and connection to nature. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the leader led Thomas to a high point overlooking the lake. She gestured for him to sit, and he complied, feeling the cool breeze on his face. The women joined him, their presence steady and calm. Thomas looked out over the water, the lake shimmering like liquid silver in the fading light. The moment felt sacred, filled with quiet reverence for the land, the water, and the bonds he had formed. The leader spoke once more, her gestures slow and deliberate. Thomas realized that this was the culmination of his journey, a recognition of his growth and a celebration of the trust and respect he had earned. The other two women mirrored her gestures, creating a sense of unity and acknowledgement. Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude, understanding that he had been given an opportunity few outsiders ever experienced: to witness, learn, and become part of a world built on wisdom, courage, and harmony with nature. That night, as Thomas lay beneath the stars, he reflected on the lessons of the past weeks. He thought about patience, humility, courage, and respect, and he realized how much he had grown. The encounter at the lake, which had seemed accidental and even troubling at first, had become a life-changing experience. He understood that true strength lay not in force or skill alone, but in the ability to listen, observe, learn, and honor the world and the people around him. The three women continued to guide him, offering gentle reminders and encouragement, and Thomas felt a sense of partnership and mutual respect. He no longer saw them as mysterious figures from a distance, but as mentors and allies who had helped him grow in ways he could never have imagined. Their world, once foreign and intimidating, now felt like a place of belonging and understanding, a place where he had proven his character and found connection. In the days that followed, Thomas began to take on responsibilities within the community, contributing his skills while continuing to learn from the women and others around him. He helped with practical tasks, shared in the daily routines, and demonstrated the values he had absorbed. Each action was a reflection of the lessons he had learned: respect, patience, integrity, and courage. The community responded with trust and acceptance, and Thomas felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Eventually, the leader spoke to him in a manner that Thomas understood clearly. He had completed the journey of learning and earning their respect. Though he remained an outsider by birth, he was now an accepted and trusted member of their world. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude, realizing that the transformation he had undergone was as much about personal growth as it was about acceptance into the community. As he stood by the lake, watching the sun rise and cast golden light across the water, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace. He had entered this story as a traveler, unaware of the path ahead, but he was leaving it with wisdom, respect, and connection. The lessons of the three Apache women would stay with him forever, guiding his actions, shaping his understanding, and reminding him of the power of patience, humility, and courage. For the first time since his journey began, Thomas felt truly at home, not in a place or a dwelling, but in a sense of understanding and respect for the world and the people who inhabited it. The lake, the forest, and the women had become part of his life in a way that was permanent. A story of growth, trust, and human connection that he would carry with him always. The three women stood beside him, their expressions calm and approving. Thomas nodded in gratitude, knowing that words alone could never express the depth of his appreciation. They had given him far more than guidance. They had given him a chance to understand, grow, and become a better person. The sun reflected off the lake, casting a warm glow over the scene, and Thomas felt a quiet joy, a sense of completion, and a promise of continued learning and respect in the days to come.